this game, you gotta have that dog. Desire, that hunger. That non-stop will to win.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right, let's get it going, huh? Let's go, gather up. Come on now. All right, fellas, you gotta remember your body is like day-old rice. If it ain't warmed up properly, something real bad can happen, yeah?
Athletes, take your mark. Get set. It's time for the Addict to Athlete podcast. Hi, everybody out there. Coach Will Robinson here. I want to thank you all so much for downloading, sharing, and subscribing to the podcast. We greatly appreciate you doing so. As always, keep an eye on that website, addicttoathlete.org. You'll find backlog podcasts, information about the team, ways to get involved, and really maybe a starting line or foundation for your own recovery journey. Athletes, I want to thank everybody through the 2024 season for all the good that we did, the service that was rendered, and really all the love, I think, and compassion that you've been able to display in so many different varieties and ways. And to all of our coaches out there, I want to thank you for all your volunteerism and your athletes themselves. Thank you so much for supporting your own local chapters. Keep an eye on the website. We got some neat things coming up in 2024 or 2025, I should say. See, I write it now, right? 2024, 2025.
Still getting used to it.
At least till June. But athletes, got a great guest in studio today. We're going to be talking about some sensitive stuff, and I think it's going to be very important because, as you all know, when we go through these battles of addiction and addiction recovery, there's always a chance and a likelihood that you're going to bump into some kind of grief. Something hard's going to happen. And today's guest, I'm excited to share this conversation with because she has some front row experience with being able to navigate, manage, teach, counsel, and just be support to so many people who might have found themselves in that tragic situation. Thank you so much for being here today. Would you mind jumping in, introducing yourself? Let's talk a little bit about why your career has kind of led you to this really heartfelt, I think, for like frontline work. Yeah. And let's jump in and see what we can create with this conversation. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here. So yeah, my name is Taryn Hyatt, and I'm a lifelong Orem resident. So I love that I got to come meet you here in Orem.
Yeah.
But yeah, I came to the work that I'm in now, because it was life. I am somebody who lives in long-term recovery from a substance use disorder as well. I identify as an alcoholic because that's been, my journey. But I didn't even recognize that until life would do what life does. And I lost somebody very close and dear to me to suicide. So my dad took his life at the age of 54. And my dad is also somebody who's one of us who had struggled with lifelong addiction. And sadly, when he died, it was in 2002. Our culture was just still very much in the quietness and the shame and the secrecy around the disease. And he did not get the help and support that he so desperately needed and deserved. And when he took his life, it was a turning point for me, for sure, because I recognized that, we had two options. We could continue to silence him and shame him and not talk openly about what he had just done and what had happened, or I was going to tell a story, and I was going to make sure that people understood the darkness that had got him there. And mostly because I had experienced that same darkness.
Exactly.
And I knew I was probably the only sibling in the beginning of my brothers and sisters that just, I wasn't angry.
Yeah.
I wasn't angry. I had nothing but empathy in my heart because I'd watched him fight for a really long time, and honestly was relieved when his fight was over because it had just gotten so dark and hard.
That has to be quite a different insight for some, because you're right. The initial impulse is to show the anger because you've heard this. I don't know if it's true, but we got indoctrinated in school. Anger is a secondary emotion. It means that something's kind of preset to it. Something's pushing it. Yeah. But you went right to the reality of the emotion. You're like, empathy, heartbreak, but empathy. Yeah. That's kind of hard to do. So you had a different view, and to allow his story and his, I guess, experience and the tragedy that followed to become an instrument of healing and teaching, that you're right. That was unheard of to a certain degree. It still kind of is,
Oh,
right?
completely, right? I mean, I practice recovery and we're still hiding in church basements and other
Exactly.
things too. It's like,
Yeah.
that's what I love what you're doing,
Uh-huh.
right? Like, this is a place we don't have to hide. We don't have to be quiet. I value anonymity for
Me
people who
too.
need anonymity,
Mhm.
but I couldn't have been anonymous when I got sober because I needed everyone in my life to know how bad the struggle was so that they could help me and they could support me and they could show up for me the way we didn't
Right.
help and support and show up for my dad because we didn't know how to, right?
Mhm.
And things have changed and thank God they've changed.
Oh,
So,
for real.
it's
Yeah.
given us a place to live our recovery out loud, right?
Yeah.
And then live our struggle out loud too.
Absolutely. But that's the thing, right? So this tragedy, we usually will sign off this podcast by saying, turn your mess into your message.
Mm-hmm.
You had to have had a starting line of wanting to accomplish just that.
Yeah.
What got you then to push forward? Because you're
Yeah.
dealing with your own grief at the same time now, pursuing that experience with other people. So
Mhm.
tell me a little bit about the dominoes and how they felt
Yeah.
to get so involved as you have been.
Oh, and boy, did they fall,
bet.
So when he died, obviously we encountered the stigma and shame that everybody does when you have a death by suicide or somebody who's had an addiction. And,
Right.
and it was, what are we going to tell people? And, should we say he had a heart attack? And I said, no, we're going to tell people that he took his life. And this is why, right? This is why. And, my search began. This is back in the day of AOL dial-up. Do you remember this?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
None of this Google stuff,
Yeah.
but I started just looking for, resources. And at the time I came across an organization called the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And they were a national nonprofit based out in New York, had local chapters, mostly back east, hadn't quite moved west yet.
Mhm.
And of course, Utah did not have a chapter. So I called them up and I said, hey, we just lost our dad to suicide. There is nothing in my state. There's not a support group. There's not I need help. What can I do? And so I started to learn, what they were about. And, they said, well, we do these, events. We call it the Out of the Darkness Walk. And if you could organize one of those, it'll help you start to raise money and you can start, to work on getting a chapter in your state. And I was like, done. Let's do it. And so we held our very first Out of the Darkness Walk here in Provo, and this was back in 2007. I did it out of nostalgia on the weekend my dad took his life, but it happened to be a conference weekend. And if you're from the area, that's the local, Mormonism. And it's a big event and people are busy. So needless to say, we didn't get a great turnout, but we had people that did come.
Mhm.
And, we held that walk annually. The last one I was involved in was, in 2023. That was our 18th year of doing it. And we'd had thousands and thousands of families
I've
that came out and
participated
walked.
in that before, yeah.
Yep. And so that started the journey of just, again, getting people talking, but also getting me the understanding I needed. Because again, I was encountering people who were full of he was a coward, he was selfish, he took the easy way out. And, you can't throat punch people. So I had to have something to come back with. Actually, let me educate you, right? Let me educate you. And so I did. I spent the last 2 decades really just out in our community doing everything and anything I could to help people understand what gets people to the place of suicide, what we could do to help and prevent it, but then also supporting the people who are not just struggling, but those who are losing people they loved.
Absolutely.
So that's been my kind of life's work.
Man. And, I hope one day we can say mission accomplished, but as you know, as well as I do, things just get more challenging and more heavy. So we need more people like you and the communities that you serve to kind of step up and carry the torch. You mentioned something that I want to touch base on, and I think this happens quite a bit. I don't think the population that doesn't understand why people get to a spot where they feel like that's the only choice. You'd mentioned that, families saying, well, what should we tell people? Should we tell them maybe a heart attack? And to a certain degree, there probably was a very severely broken heart in there, and I've noticed something about the people I work with that have hearts that are too big. And I think people that struggle with addiction, and this has been kind of controversial, but I'm like, who cares? It's the world according to Blue at this point. Who cares, right? I think that people use substances. I think people kind of have that like bouts of depression and things of that nature because their hearts are too big and they feel deeply and they feel more sensitively. And so when the weight of the world, when the weight of their own families, their own stuff starts getting too big, it literally breaks.
Mhm.
And I think if we would look at it through the lenses of we're dealing with a lot of broken hearts,
Yeah.
we might look at it a little bit different.
Amen.
And so I think that analogy to a certain degree, it may not have been a heart attack, but it was definitely a broken heart.
Mhm.
When you yourself had a part of your massive heart broken, how did you keep it together
Mhm.
so that you could help others heal too? Because it's just as important, but like you've had to, I think, swallow some of that to be
Mhm.
like, I'm going to show up for people and to a certain degree, relive mine through them. Because if I can do it, they can do it. Like, tell me a little bit
Yeah.
about that connection.
Yeah, and I mentioned I'm in, recovery. And like I said, I wish I could tell you at 26 when my dad killed himself, that's when I was like, I'm getting sober, right? I'm
Yeah.
going to do this now. And that was not,
Mhm.
I mean, I definitely threw myself into the work of helping others, but it also fueled my own substance use. And
Right.
I think that's, a lot of my drinking and drug use then. It was it was the coping strategies, what
Well, yeah.
kept me alive. It's what kept me going, because I gave,
Mhm.
and that helped me. But then, I also had this other life that I lived, and I finally at the age of 36, just got to a place like, sadly a lot of us do, that, the consequences of my actions had just become too much. And
Yeah.
I had hurt the people I loved the most, my children.
Mhm.
And, I knew that if I didn't get clean and sober, I was going to end up the way my dad had ended up. And I could not fathom
Yeah.
my kids having to live without me.
See their
Right.
experience through you.
Yeah.
Yeah. That would be incredible.
And so it was a turning point. And again, thank God for that, and so I started to learn how to take care of myself, and that, it was time for me to get to process my grief without being, out and helping, because I depleted myself giving to
Yeah,
everybody. Right.
absolutely.
And got to a place last year where it was time to let that part go.
Right.
And so I'd gone back to school, I'd got my master's, I, was getting ready to graduate, and decided it was time to step away from suicide prevention in the all day, everyday nonprofit space and just breathe. I took a couple months off to regroup, and then I ended up taking a job. I'm a social worker now, but I work at the U, and I work at a place called Caring Connections, and we do
Beautiful.
grief support for families. So I'm still in
Mm,
the stuff I'd been in for 2 decades,
are.
but just in a different way,
Yeah, different caliber.
and just helping people, and we do specific groups that help folks who've lost a loved one to a substance use problem, who've lost a loved one to suicide. And, that grief aspect is so often overlooked. And
Mhm.
even though it's a common theme we all go through, like all of
Yeah.
us have grieved something, someone at some point in time,
Absolutely.
but we're not talking about it.
If you
still.
haven't, just wait,
Yeah,
right?
just
Yeah.
wait. You're
Mhm.
eligible too, right?
Yeah.
It'll happen. And so it's been neat to, to be in that space. And again, it changed for me because my mom died last year, and losing her. And again, her death was, we knew it was coming. She'd had cancer. She'd
Yeah.
battled it for 18 years. We'd gotten it very dramatically different than my dad's.
Oh,
We
yeah.
had gotten to say all the goodbyes. We'd gotten to heal all the hurts. There wasn't the
Mhm.
unsaids, but it still was like, that's my mom.
Absolutely. It's too hard. Yeah.
And now both my parents are gone. I'm 48 years old, and I
Mhm.
don't have either parent. And that was so weird to
Yeah.
feel
You're like, wait a minute. This was in the playbook? Yeah.
where
Mhm.
now what?
Uh-huh.
And so it's been neat though to get to honor that space.
Yeah.
Of
And I think sometimes we
loss.
forget that as the human experience is that none of us make it out of this life alive,
Mm-mm.
right? But the difference between maybe what mom experienced and what dad experienced was simply just the timing of it. And I think that sometimes we forget that, like, if we allow our own stuff to funnel through about the should have, could have, would have,
Mhm.
then we'll never get that wound to heal. And so the acceptance part, I don't think, you tell me this, like, I remember going through master's school, graduate school, all this stuff,
Mhm.
and, state training and all these things that say, after school specials, watch for these signs.
Mhm.
I will be 100% honest with you. And I say that the folks that I've seen that I know of that passed followed zero signs
Yeah.
that I was trained on. The giving away all their stuff there, like all these
Mhm.
weird things that you're like, okay, check the box. The only time I've ever truly been able to determine is when I've absolutely directly asked,
Yeah.
are you thinking about this? Are
Yeah.
you, looking at checking out?
Yeah.
Because There was one years ago, we call him Athlete Johnson, and his came out of the blue for me because he joined Addict to Athlete. He had just finished, doing drug and alcohol treatment. He was a young guy. We bought him some shoes to come run with us, and we say, okay, we're doing a run on Saturday. It's the village run. It's for DCFS and caseworkers for foster kids.
Yeah.
And I got a call that Friday, the day before, and his mom told me what happened, and I was gutted. I'm like, darn it. And so one of the humbling photos we have is his shoes sitting on the track empty because the team's like, what happened to him? And I dragged myself across the coals trying to figure out, what did I miss? What did I not see? His own family felt the same way. We didn't catch this. So the only way I think to really understand it is to ask about it. So I'm curious, how do we approach family, friends, colleagues, complete strangers if we have a thought or feeling or impression maybe they might need to have this question asked, because it's sensitive, but it's also very important.
Super important. And I love what you shared, because yes, in prevention, I came from that background, and absolutely do we teach. There's, watch for this. What I always shared with individuals is it's things that make you go, It isn't necessarily because again, not everybody's going to follow the stereotypical signs. It's so different for each one of us because each one of us is unique.
Exactly.
And it's a change in behavior that's unique to us. And so again, if you get, like you said, that spidey sense, and sometimes we don't, right? Sometimes people are so good at hiding their pain and keeping it private, and they're not about to tell anyone, And so again, if that person isn't out there sharing, how do we know? And it's easy to get into that guilt of, crap, I missed something. But again, if we're not sharing that, it's easy to miss. So what I always would tell families is, that's why we have to normalize the conversation that says, hey, guess what? Sometimes, and this is the phrasing I always use, sometimes when people go through this, or lose a job, have a fight, relapse on their drug of choice, get caught cheating, they might think of killing themselves. I wonder if that's happening for you, because it could be, and most often it's a life situation. Right?
Yeah.
Or it's the depression that has lasted for years and years, and I've tried everything and everything, right? Or I get a period where life feels good, and I don't know how to handle that because I haven't done life good before.
Absolutely.
It could be so many things. And so, what I've always tried to do, and I think we continue to do, is just say, again, I want to know when life isn't. I want to know that moment. I just lost a nephew to suicide, and his family, same, out of the blue, doing better than he'd ever done.
Yeah.
Yes, he'd struggled in the past, but making plans, forward thinking, all the things that we're taught,
all the things are successfully based.
Aren't part of it. And went and ended his life. And again, it's the hindsight. It's all the crap we have to learn about later that we're going, oh. And so why can't we make it a society where that crap that we learn about later, is more out there, because people are willing and feel comfortable, and they don't have that stigma and they don't have that shame. Because personally, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, the person whose stigma is the worst is my own.
Exactly.
Right? We're all harder on ourselves
100%.
than anybody else is going to be on us. And so, how do we create a culture where we're just willing to give each other grace, but mostly willing to give ourselves that same grace? Because that's where it gets tough. But just normalize it, right? Hey, sometimes when people go through, and name what it is you're worried about. If they think of killing themselves, is that happening for you?
Yeah. Normalizing the conversation. It's the same approach I took with this addiction, right? I'm like, the word addict I never liked. And so I said, we're not using that. And that rubs some folks who are the old traditionalists kind of the wrong way. But I thought that's fine, because that's that organization. And I respect it. But here it's part of you, not who you are. Normalizing a conversation like that means we have to have a conversation about that. And the hard part that I've noticed, and this is proof that I think that the Lord has a very strong sense of humor, is that me, getting married to my wife in 2000 and joining the Church of Jesus Christ, right? I get called to serve as a bishop. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Wait, what? You want me? I have a history of substance abuse. I drink caffeine. I take my shirt off when I mow the lawn in the backyard. Right? I do these things. And what I found was that there was this bizarre kind of stigma, especially with the population that's fairly dominant around here, that if if a family member took their lives, that they were pre-planned, destined to be in prison, so to speak.
Yeah.
That is fundamentally and spiritually absolutely not true.
Yeah.
And I had no idea about some of the cultural unawareness about what this really means, because can you imagine that someone that you love so dearly, that your creator, your higher power also loves unconditionally, to be like, oh, well, you checked down early, so you're in prison. No. Unraveling some of that has to be one of the most difficult and challenging tasks, I would say, on your agenda.
What? We've done it.
Yeah. Talk about that, would you?
Yeah, we've done it. So again, I was brought up LDS, and I'm not practicing anymore by any means, but like I mentioned, my dad killed himself on a conference weekend, and there was no irony there. My dad, again, not blaming an institution or an organization. It was just, again, his own self guilt and shame that when that time of year happened to come around, he's comparing himself, right? And I'm falling short, and I'm not doing well, blah, 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 blah. I know that played a role into some of it. And anyway, interestingly enough, decades later, I think it was on the 10-year anniversary of when he took his life, it was a conference weekend again, and Elder Holland spoke, and he gave his talk like a broken vessel.
I love it.
And opened up about his own depression. And I remember I had all these people, are you listening? Are you listening? I'm like, no, but I will.
Yeah,
and
I'll
of
get
course,
the footnotes.
I said, God, that guy just did more for this movement, because again, he opened up about his own struggle.
Exactly.
And that gave permission for other people to do it.
Normalize.
And so then I get part of this. I get appointed to the governor's task force on youth suicide. And we have this, group of people that comes together. And one of them was Elder Rasband from the LDS Church. And he sits down, and they're like, Taryn, you're going to be the one to talk about, how we talk about suicide and why we don't say it's a sin and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And guess what? Mormons aren't the only one that thinks suicide's a sin. Every other religion does too, right?
Yeah.
And so anyway, I talk about, again, this where it's coming from, right? We talk about the mental health aspect, and we talk about the fundamental fact that, again, when a person is in that moment, it's not a choice. No. They're not choosing this. Remember, choice implies I have options.
I love it.
They don't see options at that point. So it's a decision. Yeah, they made a decision to act on that thought, but because they didn't see another way out.
Yeah.
And so as I'm explaining this, Elder Rasband comes up to me after, and he's like, I'd never heard it talked about like that. And thank you. And then keep in mind, years later, right? Elder Renlund comes out with this whole thing, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's a long one. I can never get used to it. But, they were one of the first religions to come out and say, we fundamentally know that is false. They are not in hell.
No.
Right? God has not forsaken them.
No.
That's the whole point of, again, what we grew up, learning about in the atonement, and what Jesus did for us is that, they get to now be in a place, hopefully, like I choose to believe, that now they get to have the opportunity to overcome some of the things that they couldn't overcome here because of the limitations of our physical body, right? And so, I love that they changed that. And I remember telling him, I said, do you have any idea what that's going to do to families? Because families who, again, have lamented over their loved one going, oh my God, they're lost to me. Or, that's a belief that some people have.
And then they're like, I have to be accountable now for what I did or didn't do.
And it just creates all this again, it perpetuates that. So now for families to be able to know, my loved one is, and maybe have that belief that they are safe and in the arms of their Savior, or whoever they believe that higher power to be, and having a chance and an opportunity to again, live differently there or whatever, right? And so I love that we've changed some of that.
And we can honor them.
And it needs to continue. Hopefully other religions will continue to come around and recognize that.
But I think about that. I think, one of the basic human functionalities is that survival. Yep. And so when you look at self-preservation and you think the person that's in that mindset, like you said, that's made a decision, that doesn't see another choice out there to overcome, to face this survival, because that's what we're engineered to do. They've got to be in a very heavy place
100%.
That does not make sense to us because we're not in that mind space.
And again, it's fight or flight. We've all experienced that fight or flight
100%.
feeling where you're like either fight, flight, or freeze, right? And what I always have told people is, again, in that moment, right, our decision making is so compromised because, again, our brain is saying, this is so intense and painful and hurtful. I have to get away from this. I want to get away from this.
Yeah.
And that they could even enact lethal harm to themselves to go against that instinct to live tells you how powerful that place must be.
You know,
and if you've been in it, because I have, if you've been in it, you know, it's not about doing it to somebody or at somebody. You really believe like this is the way, this is going to spare them. And of course it's a lie. It doesn't spare them. And we know that today, but in that moment, they don't know it.
Yeah.
Right. They don't know it.
No.
They're believing that lie of depression and the brain that maybe is under the influence of alcohol or other substances. That's a huge factor.
Absolutely.
It's like a third of people who killed themselves had a positive blood alcohol at the time of death. Absolutely. That's a high number. Mm-hmm. So again, that tells me as somebody who struggles with my mental health, drinking alcohol is not going to help me. Because it's a depressant. It's going to put me in a state, right?
Get deeper.
So again, it gives us some of that insight to go, wow, okay, maybe maintaining sobriety when I am struggling with my mental health actually could help me to stay alive because we see some of that impact, right?
Well, and I think that's such an interesting angle too, because a couple of weeks ago for Christmas, our family was in New York City. We went there and I was able to spend a week there. And obviously, you can't go there without going to the September 11th Memorial. And I got a photo of all my kids. None of them were alive when that happened. Right there at the memorial. And as I was, and as they've grown up, they've heard about it. We've explained it to them and stuff. And when they compare the Freedom, the one Freedom Tower now that's still there and being the same height, and one of them kind of said, "I can't believe people would jump from that." And I said, "That means whatever they were jumping from was worse
than what they were going."
I look at what you just said, kind of in that same light of like, we don't know what it was like in there for them, just like we don't know of a loved one what's really inside their head, and to have that be a better choice has to show you like at least some kind of measuring device of.
And I love that you brought that up because I have shared this for decades.
Have you?
I have said, again, when 9/11 happened, right? Planes hit the towers. Towers started to burn. We're all watching, those of us who were alive, on national TV as people jumped. And again, none of us sat on our couches and said, you coward, you're selfish, you took the easy way out. Again, because we recognize that in that moment of literal crisis, our thinking is limited. We are not being rational. Yeah. All they were trying to do was escape an unbearable situation.
Hell.
And
absolutely.
All of us have had our own figurative or literal burning building in which we've wanted to escape. Again, I always say this too. It's not about wanting to die. Mm-mm. It's about, I don't know how to live with what is happening.
I love
So
that.
If we can do better at helping people live through what is happening, we get them to that other side, right? We get them to that other side. But again, we have to make it safe to where somebody says, I'm willing to tell you about my figurative, literal burning ass building so you can see how bad it is for me so that I feel safe to tell somebody. Because that's the scary part, right?
Yeah.
We have to make it okay for people to open up about that.
See, I think that, man, I love, thank you so much for sharing that. I love that. And that's the thing too, because then once the experiences have been happening, the people that we, have in our worlds are gone, we're now left with this, big old question mark, like, well, now what? Yep. The grief cycle is an interesting thing. And, I was working with a gal years ago who was just in an amazing relationship with an individual. And he was just, he was just a good dude. Mm-hmm. He took a job going down to southern Texas area to transport something. He was like a private shipper. And his wasn't suicide, but he got some kind of issue with the truck he was driving, got out and was hit. And the grief that this poor woman experienced was so deep. And she's like, it's been a year and I still can't get over it. I'm like, you still deserve to grieve. Absolutely. We have a really bizarre time limit we put on ourselves on how long this should last. Like, again, it's the checklist, right? Mm-hmm. It's the stages of grief. No, sometimes they repeat themselves. Sometimes they go out of order. would you walk me through your ability to teach or to help people experience the grief cycle?
And I
Because
love
it's an
that
interesting one.
yes, I love that you brought that up. So remember, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who created the stages of grief, it's the first to tell you this is not linear. I did not mean it to be a checklist. People interpreted it that way because it is. I mean, I wasn't angry at my dad until my mom died. That took me 22 years to get to the anger stage.
Congratulations,
right?
you graduated the next stage. Yeah, see?
I mean it's a journey. It ebbs and flows. It's up and down. And I've been listening to this other podcast that Anderson Cooper started lately, and it's called All That We Are, and he talks about grief because he's saying, here I am as an adult man who lost my brother to suicide as a kid. I lost my dad when I was young. Now I lost my mom. I've never grieved. Because, society, we get 3 days of bereavement leave, and you're supposed to be back to it. Funeral ends, people assume, oh, you're good. No, we're not good.
Submit the obituaries so we know you're taking it for real.
Now you have all this love for this person, and maybe it's even a person that you don't have a love for because you had a complicated relationship. It doesn't mean you're not still grieving.
There you go.
We have all this experience and stuff with nowhere to go. And, he interviewed Andrew Garfield, and Andrew Garfield, said that. He said, it's just interesting to me that, I get teary when I talk about he lost his mom. He says, and people then go, oh, I'm sorry. He's like, no, let me talk about it and let me be teary, because those tears don't necessarily mean I'm sad. It's all this love that I don't know what else to do with, and it brings me to tears. But, again, we have to allow people just the experience of letting it be messy. The grief groups that I do now, and I people all the time, I'm doing it wrong. I should be over it, or I'm not crying, and so I must not be grieving. And it's like, no, trust me, when your body's ready to cry, I'm just going to cry.
It's going to let it go.
When your body's ready to do that, right? It will do it, because we have within us what we need to navigate it, but we need people to give us the space in which to do it.
Yeah.
And Anderson said something I love too. He said, again, universal experience. We've all gone through it, yet again, we don't talk about it. We should be saying, hey, tell me who you've lost, and what's a memory you want to share, and let me share a memory of my person, and let's keep them alive in that way. So, our society is super ill-equipped.
We're so afraid that bringing up their name
it's going to make it uncomfortable.
Well, that's why with the wall I was telling you about, with the experiences of the athletes we've lost, and the reason why we do our run in September for Recovery Month, we've merged it into what we call the proxy run, where you put the name of the person you're running for on that PIB number so that they're running with you. You're running proxy for them. And we have one section in this race, we call it the quiet zone, and it's about a 300-400 yard section where we put the names and the pictures of the people that we've lost. And it's not just to overdose, it's anyone. It could be someone that died of natural causes, but it's like you're running for them. And we've had people sit and run and take a knee in the middle and pray. I'm thinking, that's someone that doesn't probably feel like they can do this out there in the real world. I think it's a hard thing. We had a tragedy in my neighborhood several years ago to two dear families in our ward and our neighborhood. My daughter was very good friends with both of these kids, and it was a boyfriend that was upset and kind of snatched his girlfriend up. They were broken up, but ended up murder-suicide situation. And I've watched the families, because and the tragedy is that the families live just right close to each other, and they've had to heal this horrible experience together. But I've watched the families as they've experienced time, and I've always said, let's talk about them, let's keep them in our thoughts and whatnot. But not a lot of people go up and say, hey, I really miss Lily today. We don't do that because I think we're afraid that if we do that, we're going to scratch some kind of wound that's scabbed over, right? Yeah. But what's the reality?
The reality is the wound's already there, and us not talking about it doesn't make it less real. They want to remember them, and especially in a murder-suicide situation. I had the privilege and honor of meeting Dylan Klebold's mother, Sue Klebold.
Oh, my heavens.
And if you know that name, it's the Columbine. It's the Columbine. She is, even though her son committed an act of unspeakable violence, he was still her son.
Still her son.
She still lost a child. And she was never allowed in her community at the time, right? Heavens. Because people were so cruel and mean. And, you have to remember that, again, we're all God's kids. Yes, and we're each capable of, I could be capable. Who knows, right? Of some unspeakable thing based on my experiences. And yet, he is still deserving of grace, and she was deserving of grace to be able to grieve that. And so I just have a tender spot in my heart for families, because sometimes that family who had the murder, they're the ones that are shunned when they also lost somebody too. Right. And part of my work also led me to see in a lot of murder-suicide situations that it was the person who committed the act of murder was suicidal first. Mm-hmm. Because you have to be in a space of intense darkness to be able to enact that kind of lethal harm on somebody anyway.
Never thought of it that way.
And so if we could maybe get them, again, the help and support they need, and a lot of times, especially in a DV situation, again, it's the shame of, holy crap, that's what I was capable of. Look at how much I hurt this person.
Yeah.
I don't know how to live with what I just did.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And so again, not that that's all fits in a nice, tidy little box, but there's just work to do there. Yeah. Where we could offer more compassion to folks and help support people, even when their loved one may have been responsible, if you will, for somebody else's life. They still are grieving too.
Absolutely. That's why I think you're right. Normalizing the conversation again, it kind of comes back to that again, because if we don't bring this up, if we don't discuss, if we don't remember, speak their name, so to speak, then the family, the recipient, the individual who's mourning the loss too, never really gets to feel the measure of how much that person meant in other people's lives. Like vicariously, these people that our loved ones influence throughout life. Like I told you with our athlete, Don, that passed, there were lines upon lines of people wanting to pay their last respects to him. And I thought, damn it, Don, if you would have just known how many people really cared about you, but that's the measure of the influence that he had. But if those people in that line don't ever go to his family and say, hey, I was out here running and it reminded me of Don in this way, then that wound won't ever get to heal either. And neither will yours, because talking about them from our perspective helps us. Right. And it only hurts, I think, in that cycle of grief, it only hurts because we love and we love so deeply that we're like afraid of the pain. I think it's a good measuring stick of how much capacity for love we have.
And that's a quote you'll hear all the time, right? Is grief is one, it's love with nowhere to go, or it's the price we pay for love. Because again, if we didn't care about humans, it wouldn't hurt so bad. And of course, none of us would trade the time that we got to avoid the pain we feel now, right? Like we cherish it because we at least got to have that experience and got to feel that love. And, there's I don't even remember who said it, but, it was the comment of basically, why do we wait till somebody's dead to share the things we felt? Because we do that at funerals, right? We get up, we eulogize, we say, why aren't we saying that at birthday parties? Why aren't we saying that to you while you're still here? And I love that idea, because isn't that right?
Yeah.
Duh. When you're alive and we're celebrating that you were born, like that should be when we're saying all those things. And
you're right.
And so again, it's and trust me, if you've lost someone, you look at life differently because man, I don't want another person to maybe go without knowing how I really felt.
Exactly.
And we take the time and we make the time so that the people who are in our circle, they'll never question how we felt because we made it an opportunity to share that.
You are so right. Last night here at home base, we had a men's group meeting. And for a while, we just kind of did like a little, Q&A and a little bit of education. And then I started noticing like, this isn't helping these guys. So we literally just pulled the Band-Aid off and started doing process groups. And last night was strong and powerful and heavy. And at the end, I said to all of them, I'm like, and I'm the leader of the group. I'm in tears. I'm like, I have so much respect for you guys. Like, I don't know how you're doing this because before I got my help, there's no way I would have done this. And so that kind of speaking truth definitely needs to become more in the lexicon of life, I think, to be able to express that. But us guys, we have a really difficult time because we think that there's angles to feelings, right? But I've also noticed that on the wall of folks that we've lost, and we call it, the athletes we call it taking a knee, ones have taken a knee, that they kind of are falling into this very strange, like 35 to 55 age range men that, we're talking bishops, and we're talking, CEOs, and we're talking outstanding fathers and, scout leaders and all these guys that you'd look at on the surface and be like, he's got it together. Men in general, I think we need to wake up and be able to talk about the stuff that
and
hurts.
again, it's a cultural norm shift, right? Because of the gender role, the traditional gender role of men. And you're right, middle-aged men, middle-aged white men, that's the bulk of who we lose to suicide every single year in the United States, to the tune of about 50% of all suicides.
Wow.
And again, if you think of how you were raised, boys don't cry, suck it up.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I mean, that's the cultural norm. Rub some dirt on it, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, men have never been given permission to have feelings, let alone talk about them and share them, So that's what we're starting to see change. And it's interesting. I have a group that just started, and it's all guys in it. And the first comment they made was, "This is so neat that it's just us." Because one, I feel safe knowing it's just me with other men. So I love that you have a men's group. But two, like, there should also be more people here. And why
That's
is there
exactly
just
right.
4 of us? And so, I think those things are starting to change. Like, I know how I raised my son. My son is all about talking about his feelings. Thank God. I'm so glad for that. And then look at what, because you taught that, right? We made it normal. And then now that he has sons, that's what he's going to teach. And so, individually, each of us can break the cycle by just what we do in our own home and how we choose, right, to create the next generation. And so it gives me hope for a few generations down the road if they can survive all this craziness right now.
I'm so glad you said that. And this is the thing too, is I was raised by a single mother, married and divorced 6 times. I mean, she put us through hell, but it was, my oldest brother, he left when I was just a little kid. So basically I was the only boy being raised by a single mother and 2 sisters. And so being the youngest, you get to kind of sit back and watch. And I am so thankful to a degree of like being able to understand that, I'm going to say that intuitive feeling of like being in touch, because I watched what happened to them and I saw how they handled things. And it wasn't like I could be the alpha male as the youngest kid in the house, right? It wasn't about any of that. But growing up and learning how to be a man was different for me, because I was like, well, okay, like the intrinsic part of me wants to fix this problem, but I know I just got to listen. And it was kind of an interesting thing. So I think the alignment for that, but on the same breath, I'm thinking, I've never been in a situation, even like now, because I get kind of emotional, so you could probably see it, but like, I've never had anybody say like, well, hey, you puss, knock it off, suck it up. And no one's ever said that to me. So I'm like, all right, so then what really is it? It's that stereotypical societal norm.
Right? That's just a societal. So again, even if you didn't have it in your own home, you've seen it with others and you've witnessed it with others.
Absolutely.
Right? So yeah.
I could tell you, as we're there in New York and I'm stepping back and I'm watching my kids kind of look at this and I'm thinking, wow, like they have a different perspective of it, but they're here. It's one of those things where like it hits you. So when we look at like men that are in these, like it's a do or die, it's make money, it's provide for the family, it's all these things. We've got to be able to talk about the stuff that's hard, that's challenging, and hopefully it lands on ears that can at least receive it, even if it's not solving it, right? Just processing it enough. So you do quite a bit of this. So I'm curious, how do you maintain your own emotional and mental health? Because that's the one thing, like for me and you, who heals the healers, right? Well, where do we go? Like, I'm curious about what you do, because obviously Addict to Athlete, one of the main things I do is I need to move. I believe movement equals healing. And, when I started Addict to Athlete and we started walking and running, and all of a sudden my clients were telling me all this stuff they never told me in my office. I'm like, why are you opening up out here on this run? It's basically EMDR therapy. And so as we're running, they're processing, and I thought I was breaking new modality ground. I'm like, I'm going to write this. And I found out, it's just EMDR. But I'm curious.
How cool is that?
It's pretty awesome.
That's so cool.
What do you do to maintain your emotional and mental fitness?
No, it's a great question, because like I mentioned to you last year is where I had realized I hadn't been, right? I had burnt the candle at every end, and I was physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually bankrupt. And, I really had to take time. And again, not everybody could be afforded the luxury that I was, and that I had a husband who was willing to say, take a couple months and
Yeah.
regroup, and I got back into a practice. Like I got back into a physical practice. I'd had my 6th spine surgery last November.
Goodness.
And so, I'm fused stem to stern, joys of having scoliosis. And, but I've had to learn how to navigate surgery without opioids because that also was something that I was concerned with. I had to learn how to get my body working again. I made sure that, so it was going to Pilates 3 days a week. It was meditating again. I hadn't meditated in a long time, right?
Yeah.
Was doing energy work to protect my energy as I would come into spaces versus just coming in basically naked and letting people's energy bleed into me, and then clearing that energy at the end of the day, right?
Beautiful.
I mean, just really getting back
Being
into
very
some
mindful.
practices, really mindful, and then sticking to them. And again, took 2 months of consistently doing those things, and then said, okay, now I'm going to find a job that I can add to that.
Exactly.
And then I did. I literally said I'll work 3 10s, and then my other 2 days are my grandbaby days. I give back to my own kids, and I get to be the grandma to their kids that my mom was to them.
I love
right?
that.
And I get to be the mom that I didn't get to be all those years ago because I too was a single mom. And I didn't get to be home with my kids. I had to work. So thank God I had a mom that helped me out. And now I get to be the mom that helps them out.
It's a beautiful.
And what a gift. So I hang out with 2 little twin boys, and they're funniest little shits ever.
I love that more than anything.
They fill my cup.
Yeah.
But it's priority though. It's a priority, right?
Yeah.
And I had to really make it one. And I still get those days where, I'll have my email back on my phone. I'm like, I wasn't going to do that.
Exactly.
It's a practice.
That's
and again,
part of
progress, not perfection, right? We all got to work on that.
Like it.
I can't do it perfect.
Really good, like foundational, like awareness, because it's the same thing. I love the 3 10s. That's genius. I think if you're in the mental health field these days, you've got to be able to break that cycle of 9 to 5 or what have you, because realistically, you're never off.
No.
You're never off, and that can't happen. And so I tell my clients, my athletes, this too, is that I am very sensitive with my time, and and I say that tongue in cheek because I was here like for 13 hours yesterday.
Right.
My kids and my family's at a point now where they're kind of like, well, I don't care, Dad, where you are, as long as, you check in with us. But I miss that stuff because I didn't have it. I think that being able to do those things for yourself, and I love the mindfulness aspects of what you're saying, we have to do our work too. And one of the hardest things I've ever had to learn, and I still suck at it, is saying no.
Yeah.
Like, this.
Boundaries.
What are those? Yeah. But it's true.
It is true.
And so I think that with that time, because that's the one thing we can't save or cash in on, time is precious. We got to use it wisely. And so, listeners, the thing that I really kind of want to impress on you is that all of you, in one way, shape, or form, are going to experience what we've talked about in one way, shape, or form. And whether it's through the tragedy of suicide or overdose, or even the natural causation of, again, no one makes it out of this life alive, we're going to experience it sometime. So get learned on the subject. Last question for you. I'd love to kind of know that this is the process. You said when your father passed away, you had to get on AOL and dial up. Where do people go now? Because there's a lot out there, but what would you recommend people? Where would they start? So
start with 988, especially if you're in crisis. 988 is that 3-digit crisis line number that we worked our asses off to get. And it's nationwide, 24/7, 365. Remember, it's calling or texting. You can call or text. Either one, 988. If you're in Utah, you have a Utah-based area code. There's geo-filtering, so it'll route you up to Huntsman Mental Health Institute. If you're in another state, it just means it will route you to your state's crisis center first.
Beautiful.
But then you can always say, but I live in such and such state, and they can transfer you back. But again, you're getting a trained counselor, somebody that can just listen, help assess where you're at. It's free therapy. That's what I tell people. It's free therapy. You can call and just vent. You don't have to be suicidal to call. If you're just in a state of I don't know what the hell else to do and need somebody else to help think for you, that's when you call.
988.
And again, 988. It's a wonderful resource. They're not going to send the cops unless you are in immediate danger and threat to yourself. You can, imminent harm. You're in the act of trying to end your life. That's the only time we would call 911. But we have access to mobile crisis teams. We fought hard for those. Again, these are trained clinicians and a peer that can come out. We have peer support throughout the state and country now. So 988, that is a resource everybody should
so
save.
glad you said that. I see, and I saw the need for that several years ago when we lost one of my most precious athletes. Her name was Carly, and she was a huge part of this team. I mean, every time I talk about Carly, it wrecks me because Carly brought her whole family here. She was a client of mine as a client therapist. She loved Addict to Athlete. She brought her mom and her dad, her sisters, her uncles, her whole family to this team. And then, after a long period of just success and family building, she started having children, and she got stuck in the postpartum, I think, and then had some problems. And at the time, we owned a treatment center. I said, Carly, get up here. We're going to make this happen. She comes up, does phenomenal in the residential, goes to our sober living house. And on Tuesday, October 7th of 2017, she passed away of a heroin overdose. And that wrecked me. I almost stopped Addict to Athlete. Sure. I almost put a halt because I thought if I can't save Carly, what good am I doing? And I had a dear friend that said, Blue, you're not God, and you don't have his complex. You don't get to pick and choose. And the hardest phone call I ever made was calling Carly's family, who I'm dear friends with, and saying, on my watch. But the beauty that came out of that was what the team did. But there was a part of this that got me kind of upset. And that was, there was an officer that went in and came out, and he said, she's a part of an Addict to Athlete. He's like, what is that? And I got defensive because I'm like, he's going to just call her an addict. Right. And he said, I just ran a 5K 2 weeks ago for Addict to Athlete. And literally we had just had our Salem 5K, and he was there. Wow. And I said, well, let me tell you what it is. And he's like, I know what it is. He's like, my heart breaks for you. But here I am now, like having this and whatnot. I'm a therapist, but this was at our sober living. And then they came and they took her and they were just gone. Yeah. I got thinking, if we weren't therapists, how would the people, the family, the whoever, how they didn't tell us where they were taking her. I had mobile crisis teams. Yeah. Beautiful thing that if you need that resource, call. Yeah. That is incredible. And I thought we've got to do something about this. And that's what I would assume a mobile crisis team is. We just had this tragedy. What can we do? And they'll send out, and again, our victims advocates are being better trained in our law enforcement agencies. Now at our medical examiner's office, specific to suicide and overdose, when there is a death, they do a reach out to the family because they're trying to get data. Oh my heavens. So they'll reach out to the family, and guess what? They refer them up to us at Caring Connections, and then I get to call the family and get them into a support group and get them into help. So it gives me chills, right? We've come so far from where we were 22 years ago when I lost my dad 5 years ago, right? So we are making progress. But again, it also means that each of us in our communities, we all need to get engaged and involved in the work too, so that we know what to do. Because again, we're our brother's keeper, and we need to be able just to show up and again, not fix it, not save them, but just be present with them, right? Yeah, I say that quite frequently too. Like the troops aren't coming, we're the troops. Yeah, we're the troops, so we just show up. My heavens, thank you so much for jumping in here today. I appreciate you. Thank you. So we'll put links all of this to you guys so you guys can have access to this. Please keep this podcast on rotation. If you know someone that's gone through some heavy bouts, please refer them over to it. It's going to be a good resource. We'll link everything we've talked about today in the show notes, so make sure you follow through with that. And athletes, there's always help. All you have to do is be willing to raise that hand or stand a little taller and let us know, because obviously we don't know until you signal. But more often than not, your willingness to show up for someone else could just absolutely save a life. So thank you for listening. Keep an eye on the website and do your best to turn your mess into your message.